So, hello everybody. Warm welcome from here in Salzburg. And my name is Clare. I am the Vice President at Salzburg Global Seminar. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you together here for the fourth and final online conversation to celebrate World Parks Week under the title of Nature Never Closes. We are really delighted to be together tonight, and we hope you and those close to you are all well in these really worrying times. Before we dive in, we have a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, as you see from this slide, this is interactive. It's going to be a very lively conversation. If you have a question, feel free to use the chat box. Do note that others may see your question. So if you want to say that I need a haircut, that's very true, but please know that I will read it afterwards. If you are not speaking, please mute your microphone. It will be great to mute your cell phones as well. And if you have any audio feedback, please just mute your computer speakers. Next slide. So if you are doing the continuing education credits, this slide just sets out the procedure. We have a lovely quiz for you at the end, and we hope you will enjoy it. Next slide, please. So now we can dive into the meat. Our topic today is Designs on the Future, Parks Beyond COVID. And we're building on the conversations throughout this week to take a firm and provocative look at the future. A word about my own organization as co-host, Salzburg Global Seminar. We were founded in the end of the Second World War to challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world. And since 2015, our Parks for the Planet Forum has prioritized transformative leadership and action for nature, health, and cities. So working in a very interdisciplinary way across public and private sectors with World Urban Parks and many other partners, some of whom have been actively playing parts throughout World Parks Week. So today's focus is really systemic, looking out at the crisis that we're facing and thinking about what lies ahead for nature, health, and cities. I'm sure many of you have heard a lot of references to hashtags like Build Back Better. In some ways, amidst the worry, there's a kind of euphoria. We're not going to make the same mistakes again. We're going to actually think about how we craft our planet and our societies in an altogether better way. But even before COVID, many of you on this call or those in your networks know that those on the front line of parks, of public health and environmental protection had budgets and capacity that were acutely squeezed. Many of you may feel that your work was seen as a kind of luxury or an add-on against the mainstream flows of societies and economies. And we've seen those worrying pressures at the same time as urbanization is building pace and gathering steam around the world. We probably all know that statistic that 75% of us will live in urban settings by 2050. And those trends are paralleled by alarming declines in both physical and mental health. Now we have COVID. So not only have we had that background, but COVID has done a couple of things. It's reminded us of our critical need for the outdoors, for play, for green, for beauty, for nature. It's reminded us of the need that we have to access green space and the outdoors to feel fully human, to maintain or restore our individual and collective well-being. But COVID has also shed a very harsh spotlight on how what we might like to think of as rights are reserved to only some in urban communities. Those who are already the most marginalized and deprived have least access to open space, to green parks and so on. They are also, of course, most at risk from many of the worst threats associated with COVID. And so these issues are not just about nature, environment, play, and community. They're political, they're economic, and what we're talking about today is what our societies can look like in the future with nature and human and planetary health connected at the heart. So for those of you who followed World Parks Week so far, you will know that there have already been 3 really interesting debates. All the information is available on the World Parks Week website, but the focus has included what if a set of questions and imaginations led by the National Park City Foundation and Salzburg Global. A focus on the benefits of access to nature, led by Iclay's Cities with Nature initiative. And then a whole set of questions focused on US responses to COVID, led by the US Park and Recreations Agency. So today we've got four fantastic discussants. Their backgrounds straddle Africa, Latin America, North America, and Israel. And their disciplines and their career paths straddle global public health and epidemiology, urban planning and regeneration, architecture and neuroscience, and city parks and green space. So we're going to jump in with some very brief introductions, and I'll remind you, please feel free to capture your questions in the chat box. And once we move on to a question and answer, you can either speak up and be unmuted, or we'll simply try and pick out some of the questions from the chat box. So first of all, we're going to have some lightning introductions from each of them, and I've asked each of them to also highlight something not in their bio. So first of all, we'll have Tolu Oni, who is Professor of Urban Epidemiology at the University of Cape Town and Cambridge University. Tolu, over to you. You're muted. Tolu.
Oh, yes. I'm back. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Claire, and good evening from my time zone and across the rest of the day to everyone. I'm a public health physician and I'm an urban epidemiologist. I'm based at the University of Cambridge, where I'm joint lead of a group on our global public health group on diet and activity, focused on upstream determinants of health, which I'll come to. I'm also have a group at the University of Cape Town focused on urban health and epidemiology, essentially exploring strategies to create health outside of the healthcare sector. I don't know what else you wanted to say. I think you had to say something outside of your bio. I'm a big fan of parks.
Surprise and shock us.
Okay, well, I'm a long distance runner, so parks and nature reserves are a huge part of my well-being. And so I'm particularly pleased to be here, and I look forward to engaging with everyone.
Fantastic. So now I'll pass over to Gil Penalosa, who is the founder and chair of 80 Cities. Gil.
Thank you, Claire. Originally, I'm from Bogota, Colombia, but now for the last 20 years, I've been living in Toronto, Canada. And I've been very lucky to have been able to work in over 350 different cities all over the world, in every continent, small ones, large ones, poor, rich. And I see that parks are something that is essential. It's something that is needed. Unfortunately, that is not the case in most places. And I'm especially interested in the new cities. We are going to double the population living in cities in the next 40 years. That's within the lifetime of our children. We're going to go from 3.5 billion to 7 billion. So half of the cities, half of the homes that we'll have in just 40 years do not exist today. So not only do we have to improve the parks and the cities that we have today, but we're going to have to do parks and cities for as many people as we have today.
Okay, great. And Watson, give us something surprise that's not in your bio.
Well, that's when I said that I had worked in over 350.
Oh, well, that's true. That might have been the first line of your bio, because I don't expect anybody else on the call can rival that. Now we pass to Itai Palti, the founder of Conscious Cities and the director of HUME. Itai.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me, and it's really nice to see the crowd as well, to see some of your faces. I am calling from Tel Aviv, which is where I live, and my work is at the intersection of architecture and neuroscience. So we look at how the environment affects us, all sorts of effects, behavioral, cognitive, psychological, and we turn that research into insights for how to improve spaces, to improve people's well-being, the experience of any space, whether it's for productivity or for health, or even for child development. And so I do kind of work on, through the Center for Conscious Design, on culture change for the built environment, and through HUME, the Human Metrics Lab, to create the proofs of concepts for these new methodologies for integrating evidence into design.
And what's not in your bio?
Okay, so I'm a very city person, and so probably what wouldn't be in my bio usually is that one of my dreams is to buy a plot of land in the middle of nature and have that as a home. So that's a guilty secret as a city person.
There might be some people on this call who can help you down the line. And last but certainly not least, we have Jayne Miller, who's the president and CEO of Pittsburgh Parks. She's also the chair of World Urban Parks. Jayne.
Thank you, Claire. And as the chair of World...
We can't hear you, Jayne.
Okay, sorry about that. How's this? Is this better?
We can't, it needs to be louder.
Okay.
How's this, Claire?
Much better, perfect.
So as chair of World Urban Parks, we're thrilled to be hosting this webinar with Salzburg Global Seminar. So thank you for that. And it's really an honor to be on this call and to see so many faces that we don't get to see every day since we're doing social distancing. As I am a city parks professional and have been in the public sector my entire career, except now that I'm at the Parks Conservancy. Leading efforts to really make investments in parks and equitable investments in parks. To Claire's point and to Gil's point, Claire's point about equitable access and those who are the most historically underserved are the ones who are not benefiting from parks and park access, not only in regular life, but particularly it is being really clear during this pandemic. And as Gil mentioned, the growth of urban communities has been explosive over the last 10 or 15 years and will continue to grow. And so the need to ensure that we have nature and green space in cities is critically important. If you read the Nature Fix, it demonstrates all of the research that documents for humans and our survival, how critical access to nature and green space is for our own humanity and our own well-being. So ensuring that we have equitable access is really critically important to me. What is not in my bio is I am a long distance road cyclist. And so one of the things that I love about that is not only do I get to explore cities, but I get to explore the country as well and be out in nature for many hours at a day. So that is not in my bio.
Fantastic. You're also, all four of you, brilliant timekeepers. So we're going to jump into some detail, but already I picked up on some key terms. We heard about new cities, about new thinking about spaces of all kinds, the need for culture change in the way we approach this, and also the importance of equity. So those may be some of the themes you're hearing, and I remind you just to sort of capture your questions as we go along. So we're now going to jump in for about 20-30 minutes with the panel as a conversation, no slides, and it's really around the what if. I'm going to ask each participant to take about, each speaker to take about 3 minutes to give a provocation and a radical opportunity or tipping point for positive change that they think that we should be focusing on for the future. So following the same order, we pass back to Tolu and open to you for provocations.
Thanks, Claire. So my provocation is, well, my what if is, what if health was the primary indicator of success and of performance of urban infrastructure development and planning? And what motivates me asking that question, I would say 3 things. Firstly, if we know that the majority of factors that influence health lie outside of the healthcare sector, which is a mantra we all repeat, then why shouldn't the majority of our efforts to create health lie in those spaces? The second point is, if we know that health is more than just the absence of disease, but speaks to complete physical, social, mental well-being, then why is healthcare expenditure to treat disease our primary and often sole measure of health delivered? And lastly, I'm sure we've all heard the saying, so if it's not measured, it didn't happen. If it's not measured, you can't address it. And yet we intuitively believe by doing what we feel would be good for health, but not measuring the impact on health, we essentially enact a kind of trickle-down health philosophy. So my work, what I did mention in bio, my work is focused on largely on rapidly growing cities, primarily in the African continent, because that's where a lot of Africa and Asia, where a lot of the growth is happening. And in these spaces, you see rapid change in the built environment, unplanned growth, inequitable access to physical and social infrastructure to support health. We also have a very young population that often is described as the, you know, the secret behind the upcoming development of the continent. But we're seeing a rise in non-communicable diseases at earlier ages. And that, I think, is a significant thing, a significant aspect threatening those development gains. But I don't think all is lost there, because I think there's an opportunity in that dynamic space, in the fact that there's so many different actors working and thinking about urban development, to rethink urban governance with a focus on systems for health. And I distinguish that from health systems as an umbrella term that includes healthcare as a necessary and important component, but is part of a broader systems of health that influence health, such as the planning and the urban development. And so I think it would be important that when we start thinking about creating health, particularly in the context of where we are now, ask ourselves, how do we as a society galvanize for access to these important social infrastructure, to address those underlying barriers to improvements in health as readily as we mobilize to protect the needy in times of crisis. Because we've seen the responses to COVID at the moment, just unprecedented breaking down of silos, health becoming everyone's business, all the things we've been talking about for a long time, and that we've previously considered impossible, implausible, radical, and yet those are the things that are playing out now. So if we go back to my initial what ifs, and I don't know where I am with time, but if we put a different spin on it, I'd ask, what if the majority of our efforts to create health are focused on the natural built and social environment? And what if our measures of health focus on improvements in quality of life and attainment of potential? And what if we deliberately measure the health impact of the key aspects of those activities in the city and use those and align those to inform incentives given to organizations, public and private? I think I would end by saying that it would be important to, when we think about creating such seismic shifts in urban governance, to really health-proof the future of our cities, that we recognize innovation as a process where we start to integrate foresight of thinking about health beyond reaction when health is lost, by investing in those infrastructures. So next time you lose a little bit of health, I challenge you to think that in addition to seeking healthcare, ask if your neighborhood urban planner or the mayor of your city or your park ranger should be the next person you pay a visit for healthcare, because they play a vital role in flattening that curve of the baseline need for healthcare and to build the herd immunity to protect our collective health in the long term.
Okay, well, probably the term herd immunity is in itself a provocation at the moment. That was a great provocation, Tolu. I'm going to pass straight to Gil Penalosa. I'm trying to catch some key terms, and I'm seeing some really good questions already coming into the chat box. So what will happen is that each speaker will say the things or provoke in the way they want, but they're also very free to pick up on things they've just heard or also things they're seeing in the chat box. Gil, over to you.
My what if is, what if we evaluated our neighborhoods, our cities, our countries, by how do we treat the most vulnerable citizens, the most vulnerable? If we evaluated parks, the infrastructure and the uses according to the most vulnerable, I mean by age, the children, the elderly, but as well as everyone that is poor or racialized or ethnic minorities, So that has to be the key. As an example, from the point of view of parks, I think the two segments that are paid the least attention are the small children. I founded an organization called 880 Cities, which is simple. What if everything we did in our cities the sidewalk, the park, the crosswalk, the games, everything, the libraries, restaurants, had to be great for an 8 and an 80-year-old. Not 8 to 80, but 8 and 80 as an indicator. And when I see parks, I think with regards to children, we assume that all children are maybe 6 to 12. And we pay very little attention from the little children 0 to 4. And I've done work with some magnificent people called Urban 95. Urban 95 has a simple concept. What if we could look at the city, we could leave the city from 95 centimeters height, which is the height of a 3-year-old. It would be totally different. I go to many, many cities. I've worked in, I said, over 350. And in most of those, I see many more parks for dogs, fantastic parks for dogs, than parks for children 0 to 4. It seems like we know much more what makes dogs happy than what makes children 0 to 5 happy. And the other segment that we don't touch is the older people. Older people, sometimes society, we cross people out when they retire as if they had died, except that they got 20, 30, 40 years left. And the older people, they are givers, they are not takers. They are assets to the community, not liabilities. But in places like the US, only 4% of the park users are older people, even though they have most of the time. Why? Because we do parks when there's almost nothing for them to do. So around the world, this is magnificent. Imagine the parks movement. If we could build a movement where the over 60 people were our most promoters of parks. They have knowledge, they have experience, they have time, and they could be our fantastic allies to raise. Why do we need it to raise? Because now, for example, we're going to have a lot of money to restart the economies. But if we don't make a good case for the parks, all of that money is going to go to roads for cars and bridges for cars and not on parks for people. So we need to make the case. At this time of the COVID crisis, we need to have leaders thinking that parks is synonymous with mental and physical health. Parks are not something just nice to have. The parks people cannot be the clowns of the city that are called in for New Year's or for the independence celebration, but that parks are called in because it's a way to tackle with the COVID crisis. It's a way to also combat climate change. It's a way to jumpstart economic development. So parks, we need to do something great now. We cannot wait for the transition or for the crisis to go away. If we think parks are gonna be relevant in the new normal, they gotta start being much more relevant today.
Okay. That's fantastic, Gil. So we're hearing there a very strong focus on the two extremes in generational terms. And as we've all seen through COVID, the way we're thinking about generational equity is taking on a whole new light, either in terms of how we care more about the family bonds we can't treasure, or how we're seeing some segments of the population seeming to have lives more dispensable than others. So there's a lot of politics behind all of that as well. And then this issue about the COVID dividend, what monies may flow and how could that be leveraged? So great points to capture there. So now we're going to pass on to Itai.
Hi, yeah. Tolu, are you standing this whole time? You are?
Yes,
Good for you.
I am. I've been sitting all day, so I had to get some steps in.
Okay. Right, okay. First of all, there's a very distinguished panel that are saying a lot of important things. So I'm going to try and add specifically from my perspective, which is science-informed design. And my what if is, what if the pandemic can change our relationship with nature? And I'll try and break it down into a number of processes that I think are important. So assuming that everyone here who is interested in parks already knows most of the benefits that parks can have for human health, that we use it for exercise, that we use it to socialize, that we can use it to relax. But one of the things that I think inhibits or doesn't allow everyone to enjoy nature or get the benefits of nature is the way that we distribute parks in cities. The nature of a park as something that's fenced in projects a message, a binary message of either you are in the city or the park. And by doing that, it means that the routines that form our habits that allow us to connect to nature, whether it be through parks or whether it be through nature within our streets. We don't get to do that because parks are seen as a destination. And the first thing I think is important here is that nature of looking at parks not as a destination, but as something that is part of the city's fabric that needs to expand out of their fences. We need to see where nature fits into our cities rather than how can we isolate nature into certain areas of our city. So the post-pandemic city, there's a lot to say about it. I'll try and split it into what hasn't changed or what has changed. What hasn't changed are all the benefits we know that nature can give us. So some of them are more widely known, some of them are less widely known. And when we talk about how do we use science to improve human health, we look at nature for things like reducing anxiety or helping creative thinking or restoring certain cognitive functions like attention. And that hasn't changed, right? What hasn't changed also is that we are going to go back into the streets and the parks are going to be in the exact same place and the trees are going to be in the exact same place. And that means that we're likely to get into the very same habits and routines that we had in the first place, unless we change something systemic in the way that we approach nature. And I think this is where my optimism, perhaps in this very difficult situation of the pandemic, comes in. Perhaps through this isolation that we are experiencing and this severing of certain spaces in the city from whether we can access them or not, will allow us to create a better awareness of what nature's role is in our lives, but also what role do we have in nature's life, in nature. And so I, for example, do my best thinking when I'm walking around the city and I experience different sights, sometimes through nature, sometimes through the city. And it's something that's very missing for my existence, but I think it's a lot of people will feel very similar about different things. And so coupling this kind of new awareness with our ability to measure, and this is where Tolu's comments I think are really important as well, and our ability to measure where the distribution of parks or where the contact with nature is having the best public health benefits. Those two things, this change in mindset and the ability to prove the worth of nature to people, I think can lead us into a post-pandemic city that looks at parks differently.
I think you've coined a new term there, Itai, the post-pandemic city or the post-pandemic park.
Oh no, that was it. The post-pandemic park, maybe.
Post-pandemic park. Okay, great points. Let's go straight to Jayne and then we'll dive into some questions.
Thank you, Claire. So, I want to build off on what our speakers have already talked about, and that is to look at parks not as destinations, but as fundamentally physically integrated into our daily lives and integrated in the city, whether it's parks, green space, nature, but that is fundamental. And with that basic fundamental understanding and future of what our city should be, what if all of the spending on that green space and parks and nature and investments in those spaces was based on park need data and neighborhood demographic need data, with the funds allocated to the parks and those neighborhoods that have the greatest needs, that we're looking at demographic data such as racially concentrated area of poverty, family poverty, crimes against persons, the air quality, tree canopy, black carbon data of those neighborhoods, that we look at the water quality. We look at health indicators like diabetes, depression, anxiety, asthma, obesity, and that those neighborhoods that have the worst indicators of those are the ones that should be invested most strongly in their parks. What we are seeing in this pandemic is that those individuals in our communities are the ones who are most underserved on a day-to-day basis and need these parks and nature areas most, and yet we don't invest in them. And so as we move forward, shouldn't that be our moral compass? That we make those investments in cities and in neighborhoods that have the greatest need, not in the neighborhoods that have the greatest wealth.
Wow, that's a fantastic vision and a wonderful provocation. Let me turn it back to all of you for a conversation, but I want to pick up on a couple of strands that are emerging through the chat, and then you can choose to target in on bits more or less as it fits. So we've got a set of questions that are connecting two things. One is great enlightened policy from the past, at least in certain countries, around health and social policy, the idea of that being embedded in the whole notion of urban design and the kind of collective public good. And why did we lose that sense? What were the factors that led for us to perhaps privatize some of those aspects and lose that sense of the common good? And related to that, Alison's question about the issue of the story dimension of that, how those kind of policies shaped the green spaces and the things that we may have inherited. And in that context of why have we lost it? As has been said, particularly by Itai, a lot of people on this call are choosing to give an hour to this conversation because you believe in the case for action. But who don't we know how to talk to? What evidence does not connect to policymakers? So that's a sort of drawing strands together. But let's throw that open because it also ties in, and I'll pass back to you, Tolu, to start with. When you talked about health-proof governance, systems for creating health, which in a way picks up to those comments I've just raised from the chat box.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I actually want to pick up on where, in answer to your question, where Jayne left off in thinking about that fantastic provocation. And because I think it really ties in where you started, Claire, by saying how health is political. Because I'm struck by, earlier this week, I was listening on a webinar with Sir Michael Marmot, and he was presenting some presentations on inequalities in the UK. And one of the things that really struck me as phenomenal was a chart on the trends of health, of budget cuts in different local authorities over a period. And we know in the UK, local authorities have had their budgets cut over the years. One of the things that I didn't know and I found striking was that actually those cuts, the poorer local authorities had the greatest cuts. Yep. So when we start thinking about budgeting related to investing in local spaces, very easily we can't divorce it from the politics, because very easily we find that actually those areas that need the most have the least budget because they're not treated equally. So I think I would add to your provocation, exercising our democratic rights around pinning our democratic rights of how we exercise democracy around those core values. Because I think that is where it all ends up as. Otherwise we end up with, oh, okay, we have this small pot of money, what can we do? And we actually can pat ourselves on the back because we're doing a little bit, but not making any difference significantly at scale. So I think it's really important, that governance aspect of things. And one of the things I'm particularly interested and excited about in seeing the responses to in this current COVID context, how a lot of those barriers in sectoral thinking about expenditure are just disappears. This is kind of what I've been working on for a long time. So, okay, how do we think about expenditure in health and housing, and then suddenly everyone's doing health. No one's saying, well, health isn't my area. Suddenly it's everyone's area. So I think that catching on that, continuing on that kind of intersectoral thinking, Cape Town, where I lived for a long time, is thinking about the emergence from this pandemic, and thinking completely intersectorally in ways that just come second nature now, but haven't always been. So I think it's really important. And then the last point, just that you started on, Claire, around the past. Mm-hmm. It absolutely is going back to where we were. Civil engineering, planning, and public health, they were all the same. We came from the same place. And somehow I think to some extent it's the more we know, the more we knew, the more we separated things out, and we separated things out on the assumption that we intuitively knew what we were trying to achieve. But at some point our goals diverged along with the speciation, and I think we're now coming, nothing is new under the sun, as they say, but we're now coming back around to understanding, well, maybe there was some logic. Maybe it wasn't just, you know, we threw away the baby with the bathwater, and I think we're trying to find that back again.
So that's an alluring vision of Back to the Future. Gil, do you want to jump in on those questions, or specifically things that others have said?
Yeah, I think that we must be humble enough to realize that parks people, we have not done a good job making the case for parks. And I'm actually amazed how many parks agencies around the world and across North America are getting ready for the cuts, because there's going to be an economic crisis and there's going to be cuts. Well, there's many other people that are getting ready because there's going to be lots of money. The people that build roads, the people that build bridges, the police, the military, all of those. So we got to make the case. For example, whenever there is a crisis, the police, they just are better at blackmailing the decision makers. They say, well, if you want more people dead, cut my budget. Well, actually, once you go above certain range, you're gonna get a lot more safety investing in parks than investing in more police. But we haven't made the case. We almost given up. And I think that for this, it's not about talking about parks. Parks is the means, not the end. The end, during the crisis, we need to talk health, mental and physical health, and how parks is the means to have good health. In the process of the transition, we are going to have to talk about even climate change and health and others. And then towards the end of the transition, we're going to talk about economic development. How investing in parks, both building new parks, is very labor intensive. And the uses and the activities, which is almost more important, because parks are successful if people visit, they stay and they come back. So for that, you gotta have programs, and programs are very labor intensive. So we need to make the case how the money, the governments are gonna have to go into debt to restart the economies. And whatever sectors they choose, there will be tons of money. All the other sectors, there will not be any money. So parks can be in one of the piles or can be on the other one. So let's not give up and already give up thinking that there's not gonna be. So I think it is really critical, and we need to have alliances. Parks people, we gotta get public health on board. We gotta have economic development. We need to have environment and climate change. We need to have the schools, the boards of education. So I think we need to be better at making the case and at building alliances in order to make sure that parks will be relevant for everyone.
Great, thank you, Gil. Itai. You're muted. Itai, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm here. So first of all, just kind of like to preface the difference between politics and governance. So politics, parks and nature shouldn't be a political issue. In the same way that health is not a political issue. So it's left to say that parks and nature is a governance issue. And I think here I want to answer one of the questions from Hamira Sultan. Much conversation about the benefits of nature and green space, but it's as if the evidence doesn't connect with policymakers. Any ideas how to bring this evidence to life? I think this is really important also to what Gil is saying, is whether the park community has gathered around a messaging that is convincing to policymakers and not just to lovers of nature. And to me, this is where accountability comes in. And the solution for it, in my opinion, is making the invisible visible, meaning measuring the human impact of nature and seeing what effect it has on public health. As soon as you begin putting numbers to the invisible, accountability begins and responsibility begins. And to kind of give context to something similar that happened, for you all can imagine, you know, we remember, some of us or most of us remember the days when food packaging didn't have the ingredients or the nutrition contents on it, but now they do. and that changes supply and demand. And I think that's key to understanding what the best messaging for nature in parks are, by introducing metrics that shape supply and demand, therefore accountability and governance.
Fantastic, fantastic point there. And Jayne.
Thank you, Claire. You know, I think one of the critical pieces in all of this is everyone in a community having access to the public process. I think that is inherently been a missing piece of how decisions get made about money, where it gets spent, because not everyone has had access in communities to that public process. It's generally been the wealthy and the educated who have provided that input, but the poor, communities of color, disabled, other minority communities have not had that same access to the public process. So fundamental to decision making and having voices be heard so that decision makers make decisions is access to that public process, and not just doing it in the traditional ways, but working really hard to figure out ways to engage those who have traditionally not been heard from and their voices have not been shared. I also think data is critical. We all have these anecdotal information about what we believe the truth is, but so few of us use data to document and demonstrate where the need is the greatest. And so I think data is another critical piece of the puzzle. I also agree with Will that alliance is critical, not only the health, education, police, the work we do to prevent nefarious activity going on is critical, partnering with police. Economic development, parks are drivers of economic development in cities. And in order for our economies to restart, we need to be driving economic development and what parks do. Culture, arts, and humanities, and making our cities livable cities. And that's what parks do. And the bottom line is, in terms of anything, power is based on money and where money is spent. And if we engage in all of these ways with data, full access to the public process, with alliances, money will, then we can fight to have the money that we need, because that is always where the tire meets the road, is where the money is spent.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm trying to capture some of these points, but also to see the lines of the net. We've got time to take another 3 questions again, to put them out there so that you can each pick up on certain strands. So one, a really important one is, remember, we have a very diverse panel. We have very diverse participants, and countries and communities around the world are in very different situations economically and in terms of their relation and culture around nature. So one question is around concrete examples of how countries are going to actually open up parks and green spaces beyond lockdown. How do we mobilize beyond lockdown? A second question, which is going into a really radical set of interests, is a new paradigm about whether parks are actually redundant, either because we're moving to an ecosystem services-based way of looking at how we run our economies and our societies, and or because we're quitting the city in order to live in less huge urban concentrations, partly post-COVID. And then thirdly, a question that I just caught up there, which is close to our hearts in Salzburg as well, the whole issue, obviously climate, which runs through all of this, but the whole question of food systems, but also food security, food justice, food injustice, and so on, because many of the inequities we've already heard spoken about are being, of course, reflected in terms of food insecurity now, but that can give an opportunity for the new thinking on food systems, which goes back to nature in urban and peri-urban settings as well. So this time I'll pass back to you, Tolu. I'm keeping the same order going because it keeps my mind straight.
Thanks, Claire. I actually had a provocation to everyone that you kind of picked up on when it wasn't going to be about redundancy of parks, but it was going to be around the definition of a park, right? And the reason why I thought about that is in the context of a lot of cities that I work in, where you have the urban form rapidly evolving and being a lot more dynamic, not just conceptually and socially, but actually built in terms of the built and physical environment. Fundamentally, when we think about what a park is, I see that as a space, a safe space to foster, to grow kind of as a social infrastructure, right? As a safe space, green is important, where people that can foster health and physical and mental well-being, and potentially social cohesion. So if we take it apart in that way, I think it's important that we do examine and consider the different forms of and realities of cities where actually the majority of people live, because I don't think people quitting the city. I think I think there will be a minority of people on the global scale that might be shifting towards context of pandemic and leaving the city. I think the majority of people move to cities because they have no other choice, and because that's where economic opportunity and opportunity for human development lies. So I think it's important to contextualize in the broader, in the global scheme, in the global context of where the majority of urban residents are and where the majority of cities are growing. So I think that's really, for me, it just kind of, I mean, we've got some work in a couple of cities in West and Central Africa looking at the notion of physical activity in public spaces and trying to understand how that can be made safe and what health risks are faced. And from that, I'm not even at the level of thinking, oh, how do we motivate for a park in Lagos or whatever, but rather because I think the language is important, right? Because that might be something that is like, oh, we don't have space for that. But actually, if we think, is that true? Can we create space that creates health, that allows people to get together, that fosters mental and physical well-being? It's a different question, and I think that keeps the conversation going and also helps think about who then needs to be engaged. Lastly, just on food security, you mentioned there. I was reflecting recently and thinking about the indirect responses, indirect consequences of some of the COVID responses around food and physical activity. And you see a lot of the mitigation strategies in protecting vulnerable have been around food. And I think that's for obvious reasons, right? You can do without physical activity for a while, but you can't do without food. But I think it is important in Itai's post-pandemic city and space, that we're starting to see how some of those responses impact on how people move through the city and what their ability is to be physically active and to enjoy being outdoors. And also the perspective of equity becomes important there, because you see this in terms of who is able to, even in the context of the COVID lockdown shelter in place responses, who was able to have access to that. So I think if we kind of use this opportunity to think about, well, in the recovery, can we think about recovering into ways that foster engagement with nature, and foster opportunities for physical activity, for mental well-being, and for social cohesion? I think in a lot of cities that I work in, that would be a lot more creative and imaginative a space than we need you to provide a park. Yeah. Which is essentially what we're asking for, but it's just how people understand parks sometimes might close up the conversation.
Totally. And you've got, there's a lot of, if heads can nod on a chat room, that's exactly that. There's a comment from Tony Leach about moving beyond the silo of parks, but the language also reinforces silos as well. So I think that point has got lots of people picking up on that already. Gil.
Yes, Claire, I think that I want to make an emphasis that parks really is a political issue. Almost everything in cities is political. So are we going to put money in parks, or are we going to put it on roads, or are we going to put it on health or on schools or whatever? So we got to make the case, and we cannot make the case around parks. We got to make the cases about the benefits. If the decision makers and if the citizens are putting pressure on decision makers on healthy lifestyles, or on climate change or on happiness or whatever, and they see that parks is a means to get those benefits, then they will invest in parks. Also, from the point of view of defining parks, well, at the end of the day, we need nature everywhere. We need nature at home, on the sidewalks, on the footpaths. We need it at places of work, where we study, where we go. We need it everywhere. And also at this moment, also we should think even of the streets. When we look at any city from the air, the biggest public space are the streets. The streets are about 30% of the area of any city. And they are not just to move cars. For example, when I was in charge of parks and recreation in Bogota, I took a small program that had a few kilometers and a few thousands of people, and we turned it into the world's largest pop-up park. Every Sunday of the year and every holiday in Bogota, over 120 kilometers, so around 75 miles of streets are open to people to walk and bike and skate and close to cars. And every Sunday and holiday, 1 out of 4 people come out. This is really massive. And this has been a very positive virus because it came out of Bogota, and now more than 300 cities around the world are doing it. So we gotta think of this. And finally, I wanna make a case on equity, because the reality is that in the wealthy areas of cities around the world, usually you have magnificent parks. And in the poor areas, you have very poor or non-existent, when it should be almost the other way around. The reality is that in the low-income areas, when people live in 25, 35 square meter homes, you don't live there, you sleep there, you live it outside. So the low-income areas need much better public space. They need better parks, better sidewalks, better bikeways, better everything that is public. And so they need, and every citizen in the world, let's just data. The wealthiest country in the world, the US, over 100 million people do not have a park within walking distance in cities. And this is the wealthiest country. So we really need to change this. And I hope that the COVID, the crisis will get us thinking, what is the role of the parks and what is the link and how are we gonna do? And we really, the post-COVID period has to be much better. And much better, we say, sustainable and equitable, but also we gotta bring those words to specific actions.
Great, thank you. Itai.
Yeah, some big questions there. So I'm going to start with, are parks redundant? And I think that will cover enough. Are parks redundant? In the manner that they isolate nature and create this dichotomy between city and nature, yes, they are redundant if they perpetuate this kind of culture, meaning that parks have to meet people in their day-to-day lives in the same way that all other efforts in city design, when it comes to, for example, playful learning for kids or areas that are more accessible, all these things have to be distributed in a way that touch people's everyday lives. And for as long as the park is a destination, it will be counterproductive to that in a way. The positive side to it is that parks can be the place where nature grows out into the city. And I think this is something that parks need to think about. How do they integrate themselves better into the city's fabric? And I think on that note, just a word, something about the word access. We talk about access to nature and we talk about access to parks. Access is a problematic word because it alludes to destination. It alludes to the fact that we can access this thing rather than this thing is integrated into our life. And therefore, I think we should be talking about integration rather than access. And that's where the opportunity for parks to reach out, I think should be messaged around that, along with the data and the evidence that the benefits of nature to these people. The biophilia movement is in design is a movement that says there are benefits, health benefits to natural stimuli, and it's really taking off. And there is a kind of trickle down between what science is telling us and how it translates into mainstream collective awareness. Biophilia is still very young, and people don't understand how to use biophilia or natural stimuli in the right way. It's not necessarily sticking a plant in every corner. It's about the nature of nature. So it's not just the greenery, it's about the fact that nature is serendipity, nature is escape, nature is a tool that we use for our identity and for our belonging. And I think we need a bit of a process to go through until society understands that and gives nature the rightful place. And the way for that is evidence, in my opinion.
Brilliant, thank you. Jayne, over to you for final comments on those questions, and then I'll do a couple of wrap-ups.
Thank you, Claire. I'm actually going to diverge just slightly because I know there were some concerns about me talking about parks being drivers of economic development and the whole issue of gentrification. And I think it's really important to address this because to me, gentrification is not the issue. Everyone wants their neighborhoods to be well taken care of. The issue is displacement. And the issue is everyone is entitled to quality green space and parks, no matter where they live. The issue is about displacement and ensuring that no matter your income, you can live where you want to live in your city. So it's about governments and agencies setting policies that prevent displacement from occurring, ensuring that there's affordable housing trust funds, ensuring that there's regulations about multiple income housing development that occurs, that there's utility assistance so that no matter your income, you can live in whatever neighborhood in a city you want and you have access to quality green space and parks. And to this concept that parks should not be destinations, I agree. I think this whole concept of the National Park City movement really gets to the heart of that. It flips parks on its head and says that cities should be natural parks and that everything about that city, whether it's the green space, whether it's the development, everything is around that city being natural and protecting the natural spaces within that city holistically, not just separating out of parks and having them be treated differently than all the other spaces in that city.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. This conversation could run and run, and the comments have themselves been really rich. And I really want to say this is just the beginning. And I hope that people will take the spirit of World Parks Week and the spirit of the theme that we chose today to say we're a group of people that are going to build a movement looking outwards and so on. Just to pick up on maybe 3 or 4 quick themes in a sort of synthesis. I think for me, things that have leapt out from what all of you have said and the questions, one was around this issue of language and both pragmatism and cultural sensitivity and thinking about recovery, cohesion and so on, rather than perhaps conventional labeling around parks, particularly for certain country contexts. A second was around a radical and strategic approach, thinking about smart communications and new alliances that know how to speak about money and to change the paradigm about the way we think of investment and the return on that investment. That fed very, very neatly into what Itai said beautifully about making the invisible visible in terms of accountability, of the metrics that will start to inform smart supply and demand, because that again is a way of connecting to power and allowing that paradigm to be shifted. And we heard a lot, especially from Jayne, about the issue, and this is where it is political, it's about governance, but there is a political dimension, but not a transactional political dimension, I would suggest, around the question of access to public process, of opening up to all constituencies in our societies, ways to participate in the decision-making or the vision-making, and to understand the use and the application of data to support those arguments. And perhaps a final point, we saw coming through so much the issue of integration, of connectivity, some comments around it's not just green, it's blue, the whole nature of ecosystem services, our life support systems and so on, but also bringing down those barriers between nature and us, making nature part of a daily life rather than a separate destination. And that was a really nice note to perhaps finish up on. We are within the last 30 seconds. I really do feel terrible to end the conversation because it's so exciting, but please join with me in thanking the great speakers, really provocative, really interesting. This is just the beginning, and also to the organizing team at World Urban Parks, Kelly and all the team who've kept the logistics running very smoothly. And certainly from our perspective at Salzburg Global Seminar, we're thrilled to see many of our fellows on this call. This is an ongoing conversation, so please, you can find any of us very, very easily. And we would absolutely welcome keeping the provocations in particular going and connecting that to other areas of our work, which are also focusing on post-pandemic recovery. I think I will throw out a question that there's no time to answer. Alison Barnes, a big player in the National Park City movement, said, if you were president or prime minister, what is the one thing you would do coming out of this call? So no one has the time to answer it, but answers on a postcard, please. And I, for one, will certainly read it if we get a Twitter storm going on that question. So with that, we are bang on the hour. Thank you very, very much indeed. And this is just the beginning, I hope. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.
Claire.
Bye. Thank you. Really,